all so much for the invitation. This is really an honor to speak to, young scientists across the world. Yes, I do a lot of these one-on-one mentoring sessions, and please reach out by email. I've talked to well over 100 people from around the world at this point, including several from Africa and, just again, all over the world. And it's truly a pleasure for me as well. So please don't be shy about reaching out if you have any questions. I can tell you a little bit about myself. So the topic today is scientific publishing and strategies for publishing, which is, of course, one of the, I think, most important aspects of being a scientist for various reasons that I'll get into. A little bit of background about myself. So yeah, I did my undergrad degrees in math and physics. My PhD was in math, but I did a bunch of molecular biology during that time. And since then, yes, I've been working in this somewhat ill-defined field of systems biology. You could think of it as sort of quantitative molecular biology for so I've been a professor for the last 14 years. Oh my goodness. So it's been going on for a little while. And over the course of that time, I've published, like fair number of papers. I've seen a lot of different things happen with publishing, and there have been also, I think, some very interesting and hopefully positive developments, especially in the last few years, that I think will kind of change the system, I think, for the better. So, with that, maybe I'll just kind of dive right in. I'm hoping that people have a lot of questions. I'd much rather talk about what questions you have than thoughts that I have. Maybe I'll just share my screen here and tell you a little bit about, did that share okay? Everything good? Yep. Okay. So, yeah, like I said, so my background, I'm in, or my geez, how do I move this thing out of the, anyway. I'm in the departments of bioengineering and genetics at the University of Pennsylvania. So I've seen, a couple of different modes of publishing. It can vary dramatically by field. I just wanted to start by asking this question and maybe providing some answers. Why do we publish papers? Like, what is the point of this? Like, why do we go to all of this trouble? Sorry, let me see if I can see my mouse and hard for me to move this thing out of the way. Why are we publishing papers? Why are we doing this seemingly extremely painful process? And I think there are two sort of categories of answer to this. One is that, one is like, what does publishing mean for the scientific enterprise as a whole? And, we are each of us adding a little bit of knowledge to the world. And for the scientific enterprise, this is how we have chosen to distribute that knowledge. So the idea is that this is a version of record of what you did. This is a documentation of experiments that you did. And then it's a way to share what you have found with the world. So, now your data, your interpretations, your conclusions, these become part of this canon of literature that, to greater or lesser extent is accessible to the world and becomes part of the knowledge base of the world. I actually think this is a pretty amazing thing about academic science, if you think about it. I mean, people work on so many different things in the world, lawyers and doctors and people sort of, solving all the problems within the domain of what we know, like what is already known. And I think one of the cool things about being a scientist is that we get to actually shape what we know. We get to increase what we in the world know. So before people knew about CRISPR, like they couldn't do certain things. Now we can. And then it's up to society to determine, how does that filter through over, decades into, changing society, hopefully for the better, or not, whatever it might be. But that's sort of what we're in the business of doing. And papers are the bricks that we put on this wall. That's what the papers are. And with it's not published, it kind of disappears. It's also really cool. It's kind of a connection with the past. I mean, sometimes you read, especially when I was a graduate student, I would just read these papers multiple papers from one author. I remember there's one particular, it was like single author papers, just this guy doing these experiments. It almost felt like I knew this person because I had, read their papers in such detail. It's kind of a cool time machine, like a way to communicate with, past scientists and also your way of communicating with future scientists, which I think it's neat. There's also, the career aspect of publishing papers. Um, it's a very important signifier. So, you're putting your bricks on this wall. And then also you're kind of like marking the bricks with your name so that people can look at the wall and say, well, here are the bricks that, whoever it is put on there. And this is important because, that's how we measure scientific progress. Like, and, you know, in a world of scarce funds, in a world of scarce resources, we have to make decisions about, who is going to get access to those resources for doing science. And this is one way that we do it, is basically saying that, are there, people who've published more papers, like this is what we have chosen as our kind of our measuring stick for progress as a scientist. There are two reasons why I think this is really important. One is that it shows that you can finish research projects and that you can finish them at a high standard. So, um, it's very easy to start projects, but it's really hard to finish things to the level of rigor and, this scientific standard that the community accepts. And I think that that is actually a really important part of uh, why we publish, is showing that you can actually like finish things, you can bring them to the end and get them over the finish line. Publishing also, it's your way of sharing things, and it signifies who you are as a scientist. People read your papers and they get, like I'm saying, I got to know, I feel like I know this person. People are going to read your papers, and that kind of is your brand. That's like who you are. And that's why it's really important. Like, what kind of scientist are you? What are the questions that interest you? What are the approaches you take? And how, rigorous are you in actually, um, you know, providing evidence for those conclusions? You read someone's paper and you can get a pretty good sense of that pretty quickly. So I think these are some of the reasons why we publish. How do you actually write a paper? So this is somewhat different than, let's say, just the publication process, but I think it's intimately related because, you obviously have to write the paper that you want to see published, and you have to be strategic about that and so on. Um, First, I will say that writing a paper is hard. It is hard work. The first, I had one really, my big PhD paper felt like, this is my baby. I spent so much time on it, and I did all this work, and I was super excited about it. I wrote the first draft of it and I gave it to my professors, and they couldn't even, they were, they were kind of like, we can't, this is so bad. We can't even give you feedback. It's so bad. Like all these things are so wrong. We didn't even know how to, they're like, we can't even do line edit. So I literally rewrote that paper 4 or 5 times before, and then finally they were like, okay, now we can edit it. And then, it was like several more cycles through it. And I learned so much from that process. And now I consider myself a pretty good writer. I mean, I do this for a living, right? And I feel like our papers are relatively clear and engaging. It took a lot of work. Like, I was not born that way. The only way to get better at this is to practice and take feedback and, engage with that feedback and get better at it. But it's not easy. It doesn't, some people may be a little bit have more kind of intrinsic ability at this than others, but I think a lot of it is just hard work. You just, put in the reps and you'll get better at it, but it's hard and you really have to practice. The other thing with writing a paper, and this sort of speaks to the idea of, you know, the actual process of beginning to write a paper, is knowing when to stop. Like basically, when do you stop doing experiments? Because sometimes you'll see people who just kind of keep doing the research, and research never ends. Like there's never a point where you're like, okay, I'm done. You have to know when it's enough so that you can create a publishable unit. That is a difficult thing, especially for early career scientists. Like, it's hard to know when you're done. And that's where, hopefully your advisor can provide you with a lot of the help that you might need to determine, okay, this is like, okay, done, and I'll talk a little bit more about, sometimes you and your advisor may have different ideas on this particular aspect of it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think it's really important to know when to start the process of really kind of pulling things together. The other thing I would say is just start writing early in the process. I have found that every time I write, it's like writing is where bad ideas go to die. You start writing, and then you're like, oh my goodness, I really need to do this control. I really need to check this thing. I need to do this analysis because I'm trying to make this point and I just didn't think about it until it's actually words on a page. It's just very hard for hand waving thinking to survive the written word. So I really encourage people to do it early. It's hard because you know that it's going to get rewritten, but that's going to happen anyway. But it's hard to motivate yourself to write very early when you're sort of in the middle of things. But I found that it can be extremely clarifying to start that process early. I mentioned this before. Get practice by publishing as early as you can. So oftentimes you'll see, the person with the one big paper, but if you look, oftentimes they'll have like a smaller paper very early in their career. So like as an undergraduate or a PhD student early in their PhD, um, get some practice with publishing as early as you can because there's a lot of different parts to it. There's a lot of, what they call hidden curriculum area things about publishing that you might not know up front, and just getting some experience with how this process works is, I think, very useful. It also really helps you clarify, like, what can you expect from reviewers of your paper? What can you expect from the publishing process? What really matters for my paper? How is it being judged? I think that's a really important thing that sometimes can get lost. Sometimes I have people in my lab sort of work on myself, kind of say like, oh, let's work on this area. And then after we're writing it up, we're like, we could have saved months by not doing that because in the writing, you're like, actually, this doesn't matter. And you only get that through experience. And so get early experiences, I think, one of my takeaways. Another thing with writing a paper, and this may be a little counterintuitive to some, is organize your paper for how it will be read. Papers are read like so. New York Times articles don't save the punchline for the end. They give it to you in the headline, they give it to you in the first paragraph, they give it to you in the first page, and then they give it to you in the whole thing. So it's like the most read part of your paper, the part that people are going to read the most, is the title. By far, the biggest engagement with your paper will be the title. Usually, we do the title at the end and kind of as an afterthought, right? That is by far the most read part of your paper. Second most read is an abstract. Third most read is figure one, and it is geometrically decreasing from there. Okay, so very few. I have had papers in a field, and I have a good friend who's also a PI who was in this same field. This paper that we wrote is like directly relevant and it's like great paper, whatever. And then I talked to him and he was like, I was describing some experiment. He's like, "Oh, you did that?" I was like, "Yeah, it was figure 3 of this paper, man." He's like, "Well, I don't know." Like people just do not read all the way through papers. And one of the most counterintuitive things, I actually learned this from a student who was in another very successful scientist lab. It said that my PI likes to have everything in figure one, like kind of like a summary of the paper in figure one. It's really counterintuitive. Normally we think like, traditional storytelling, you watch the movie, like you don't have the big final battle scene at like minute 10. You watch it at the end of the movie, right? No. So when you write a paper, you really want to have the conclusion, the main story should all be in figure one. And that actually requires a little bit of rejiggering compared to how we would normally do it. When you give a talk, it's very different. People hopefully stick around to the end. So, you can put a punchline at the end. But in a paper, it's really just pack it all up front as much as you can. That's really, I think, the most critical thing because, the engagement with your paper is just goes down and down and down the further you get into it. So that can be really important. Okay. How do you actually publish a paper? And I feel like this is an area where, there are many lessons that still apply. There's also a lot of changes going on right now, across the publishing industry. In my opinion, certainly not fast enough, but, whatever. It's a big ship, it changes. But, there are many people working on it. Um, so just, to very quickly, for those who are perhaps less familiar with it, the ideas behind how you would the way the mechanics of how you publish a paper is you sort of assemble your manuscript, you assemble nowadays also all things like data and so forth. You upload that to the journal. The journal then decides whether to send it to review. So most journals will actually say, okay, well, like, is this paper, good enough for our journal? And there's a number of different ways of thinking about that, but, regardless, that's what they decide. And then they decide to send it to peer review, which means it goes to, three-ish people, quote unquote experts in the field who read this paper, render judgment on the paper, submit written comments, and then you get those comments back. And there's a range of things that can happen. So one is that you get those comments back and the comments are like, accept this paper immediately. It sounds crazy, but that has happened. And then paper just goes in. Then there's often, usually they'll ask you to do something like fix the paper up in various ways. And this is, you have to revise the paper, like make it better to address their concerns. And that's another whole, set of things to do. And then there's, just rejection, like the reviewers said, this paper is technically unsound, or this paper it's really boring, which really hurts. They'll say that, this is just not interesting, whatever it might be. And then those may be, grounds for rejecting the paper. So at that point, you kind of can't continue and then you go on. Now, there are many times when the journal will reject your paper, but they don't actually reject it. And this is sort of this hidden code that I wish was gone, but it's kind of there. And unfortunately, you have to work with your advisor to really help parse a lot of that, is one thing. Because sometimes no doesn't mean actually, rejection doesn't necessarily mean rejection in the context of publishing. One of the things so I'll go, I guess, into a little bit more of, how we think about it, at least in my lab. So one of the main things is these days that's been a huge change is to submit a preprint. So for those of you who don't know about preprints, this has been around in physics for a very long time, but recently it's come to biology. Basically, you take your final manuscript, the thing that you would submit to the journal, and you send it to what's called a preprint server. And that preprint server, I mean, there's some very light moderation. I mean, they'll just check whether it's a paper of, a reasonable paper, but they don't do any kind of detailed peer review on it. And within 48 hours or 24 hours or less, that paper will post to the preprint server and you can send it to your friends. Anybody in the world can look at it. I think it's probably the most positive impact in the scientific publishing system that I can remember. It's just been hugely beneficial. I think the idea is that it accelerates science. So we've had, in our lab, we've used techniques that have been on preprints well before they're published. And that's because we can read about it. We can just do it right away. And we've had people use our lab's techniques also using preprints. So I think that has been just a hugely wonderful sea change. That's also, so I talked about, things that are good for science, things that are good for you. So I think preprints are definitely good for science. Are they good for you? And I think the answer there is, I think definitely yes. Um, I have had people apply for faculty positions and I've looked at their CV and they say, oh, I have a paper that is not yet published, but here's the preprint. And if, they're, um, that counts much more than like, I have a paper in the review process because I can actually go to that paper, I can read that paper and I can say like, well, what kind of science is this person doing? I can judge for myself. So it can really help you, I think, in terms of getting to that next career position, especially because unfortunately, review processes have gotten very long. And I personally think this peer review system, I don't know how much longer it can continue this way. Scientists just don't even want to review all the papers that people are making. And consequently, the whole system is starting to really creak under the pressure. Okay. But anyways, I think pre-printing is a great thing. If you can convince your PI to do it, great. Sometimes advisors have various reasons not to do it. You can try and push on it. If they really don't want to do it, then what can you do? But I think familiarize yourself with the process and hopefully they will see some benefit to it. The next thing I wanted to talk about is selecting a journal. So then the idea is that you want to publish it in a journal. You may ask, like, why am I bothering to publish it in a journal if I can put it up as a preprint? A very good question. I mean, to me, the things that journals do very well, still, and they really have a really important role in this, is getting visibility for your paper. So, if you publish a paper in a, high visibility journal like, Science or Cell or Nature or something like that, and also, like Molecular, so there's a very, large number of high tier journals. Those papers are going to get read more because people kind of look at those, they just read those journals. There are too many papers for somebody to read all of them. This has been a change that actually started around, when I was starting my PhD, maybe a bit before that, but it used to be that the scientific community was much smaller. And consequently, people could publish in like, Journal of Bacteriology, and you just send your papers there and they would get published there, and that was fine. Because the community was small enough, I remember professors that would just go and, every once a week would go to the library, pull out that journal and just read it cover to cover. They just look at every paper in that field as defined by that journal. And they would kind of be up to date and they knew the people, it was a much smaller community. Now that the communities are so big, we need somebody to curate and say, look, I mean, you can't look at every paper. So here is a way to kind of limit that range. And we can, certainly there's many flaws in the system, but, something like it is necessary. And in any such system, there will be flaws and, winners and losers. And sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's not. Something like that's always going to be there, but the bottom line is that our attention is limited, so visibility is a really key consideration. There's also appropriateness, so like, is this the right journal for the kind of work that we're doing? So that's another thing you want to look at, and you want to also look at like, what's realistic in terms of where you might be able to publish. Like, can you publish in XYZ journal? Is this the right kind of venue? There are many different review processes. So eLife, I think, has been really at the vanguard of new publishing models where they, if you submit a paper there and it goes to review, it will get published, regardless of what the reviewers say. So you kind of have escaped the tyranny of the reviewer experiments. There's pluses and minuses to this model. I'm just glad somebody's trying something new. I think that is an intrinsically good thing, and I think their model is the right one. So, but there are many different review processes, and they may shape what you want to do. So that's maybe a thing to consider. And increasingly, also fees. I think it used to be that fees were not kind of a rounding error. Now they're like pretty substantial for some journals. especially with the move to open access. But some journals will charge you ten to $15,000 to publish a paper. There are many waivers for this, if you just don't have the money for whatever reason. But just keep that in mind. I think especially if you're at a place with fewer resources, that can be considerable. But then again, like I said, I think there are waivers and so forth in place. Another thing is pre-submission inquiries. I think maybe I'd rather get to people's questions, so I'm gonna not talk about that as much. But you can basically ask a bunch of journals at the same time. Um, would you be interested? And then hopefully you can get a sense of what's interested and then formally submit there. So it can save you some time from kind of one by one shopping. Strategic considerations for your career. So the things that matter the most are just straight up first author and co-first author papers. That's what matters the most. And when you're working on, when you're thinking about your work, like, I definitely encourage being collaborative. Helping people out is really important, both for your development and for the community. But just keep in mind that this is what you're measured by. So you have to be smart and make some sort of cost benefit analysis. Should you go for one big paper versus multiple smaller papers? You can be successful doing either. I think the thing is, I'm sorry, I can't move my the window so I can't see. But I think what I wrote there is like think about what your narrative would be. It's not really about like, is this a paper in this journal this big or that or whatever, think more like longer term. When I give a talk about my work, if I'm giving a departmental seminar, what's going to be in that seminar? How am I going, what is like is this are the pieces like this, like I'm building towards one larger thing and here are the stepping stones and maybe here are the smaller papers, or is it like here's this one big thing, it all kind of fits together in one arc and then it's one larger paper. I don't know that one is kind of better than the other in terms of your career. I think that especially for PhD students, either can be very successful. As a postdoc, I think there is perhaps a bit more of a onus on the one big paper, but I've seen definitely many postdocs that we've hired as faculty who have, multiple smaller papers. It's just they all kind of have to fit together. It's got to tell a story of some kind that says who you are as a scientist and what's interesting about you and what you're doing. Another thing that you sometimes have to do is manage your advisors. So, you know, generally, your goals should be pretty aligned. Both of you want to get papers done, right? That's what people want. One of the challenges sometimes, though, especially with more senior PIs, is that they're just so busy and they have a backlog of things to do, and it's really hard. Sometimes you're like, I gave my paper and I'm sitting around for a month waiting for them to review it and stuff like that. Think about if you were a busy person who often has only like 15-minute time slots to get stuff done. If you just send your whole paper and say, please review this, they're looking at this as like, that's a really long task. This is like 4 hours of work. And so, yeah, I'll wait until I have 4 hours of work. And then that doesn't come. I think the better strategy is to make things sort of bite sized. So it'd be like, okay, I wrote the introduction. Can you quickly look at this? I flagged the parts of the introduction that I had questions about. So now they're looking at this as like, okay, I can quickly do this in between two meetings. I can look at the tag places. Oh, let me make these corrections and stuff. And then it's a much smaller thing. And then you kind of parcel it out to them. So I think that's one really good strategy to sort of manage your advisor in one way. The other thing is to really think about sometimes advisors want to add more to the paper to make it into a bigger story, to get into a fancier journal. You can decide maybe that is also your goal. One of the things I would say that's really important in thinking about this is sometimes it's just the paper is what it is, and you can do more and more and more, but it won't get you into a better journal. I had one trainee that I saw, up close, kind of their struggle with this, where they kept sort of adding more to the paper, and in the end it was a great paper, but it was just it wasn't going to be one of these papers, and it felt like they just kind of did a lot of extra stuff that added fully a year and a half to their PhD, and it was for what? I don't know that it really did much. So I think one way to do this concretely is, okay, if I do this extra 6 months of work, am I going to change the title of my paper? am I going to change the abstract of my paper? Like what changes in there? If it's not anything really big, then was it really worth doing? Like, is it really going to change the outcome? And I think maybe that's a good way of thinking about it if you wanted to sort of make it very concrete. If your advisor and you have like very different things, the only thing you can do sometimes is just have a pretty frank discussion and say, look, I've been here a long time. Like, I need to move on to my next career stage. I feel like, this is kind of done. And, oftentimes advisors will say, okay. And you can say, may I can the next step someone else could do this or whatever. There's a number of different things that gets highly specific, but there are ways of managing that. One of the things I also want to talk about just very briefly, and this is becoming more and more of a thing these days, is reproducibility and rigor. These days, almost all the journals are asking you to upload data, manage your data, um, share your code so that people know how you did your analyses. Um, do all of these things as early as you can. It's a little hard. The repositories are a pain in the butt to work with. Honestly, can be quite burdensome. But this is a requirement. I think it is important for the science. I think maybe we've gone a little overboard or we don't have the right tools for doing it. So it can be quite onerous at times. But just keep in mind that increasingly this is just kind of required in the field. Uh, it's it's scary out there because now people are running things through analysis things trying to out people on PubPeer for sometimes honest mistakes, sometimes not honest mistakes. So there's a lot going on, I think, in this area these days. But just I think it's really important to write your code like somebody's going to read it and organize your data like somebody else needs to access it, because that's what's going to happen in the end. I just wanted to again quickly plug, like, if people have any questions about like specific things, just give me a call, send me an email. We'll find a time. Like I said, I've done well over 100 of these calls so far, and I'm happy to do more. So, all right, I'm going to try and get out of this here. Yeah, so I'm happy to take questions.
Great. We already have one question. Maybe the speakers can ask their question themselves, if they wish. Otherwise, we can ask it.
I think Snusha, they would have to be promoted, so we'll keep monitoring the Q&A. So please type your question in the Q&A. And you can also I think you may be able to raise your hand if you want. We can also promote you and allow you to speak to Arjun directly. But maybe right now we start by reading the questions in the Q&A. And Raj, also feel free to not run through the questions. I think you have access to the Q&A. If there's anything we miss or you want to emphasize on, feel free to. Snusha, maybe you want to go on with the first one, and then I'll go through the attendees and see if anybody's raising their hand.
Yeah, so this question is by Letitia Amama, sorry. As a scientist, should our focus only be on publishing papers, or should we take the initiative to actually see to it that our findings are implemented?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, I think it depends on what you want to do. I mean, to be honest, I think academia, my personal feeling is that academia is about, publishing papers. Like, we're about having ideas and sharing those ideas. I think the implementation of those ideas is often something that takes place outside in society. That said, I think there's a big gulf between, the ideas and their potential applications, and many of these ideas could have application, but just don't. In my experience, if you want to make things happen, you have to do a lot of work on top of the publication process to get something implemented in the real world. And, that's a rewarding process. But I don't think, it's necessarily rewarded academically. I mean, to some extent it is. I mean, they look at your, patents and things like that, and whatever. But I think it's sort of a separate area. So it's a thing that, in academia, you often have the flexibility to go after those types of things as well. So I think as to, whether you should do it or not is, I think, a personal choice.
Okay, and the next question, I've actually been seeing this on Twitter a lot. Nathaniel Amasa's question is, what's your opinion on using AI to write and publish papers?
Oh yeah, I am very pro AI. I think that you know, I think people have a lot of strong feelings about this. And I think a lot of people feel like, AI is terrible and awful and whatever. But the way I see it is it's like a very, very powerful tool. And um just like any powerful tool, like if you're working with a drill, like be careful with it. You can do immense harm with it, but sometimes you just need it and it can really help you out. I think that AI for papers can be super useful if you want to just check your writing. And a lot of people think of it in this sort of generative mode, um, where it's like, oh, can you just write my paper for me? And I think, generally you'll find that it doesn't really work like that. It's more like an assistant. And what you can do is say, for example, here's my introduction that I wrote. Point out to me where it's unclear, and it will highlight the parts that are unclear. And I think that, and generally it's quite good at that, actually. It'll help you find areas. I think if English is not your first language, this is an excellent way to like provide a much higher sort of quality to your written work. I mean, should you learn English? Yes. Should you use AI to check and help teach you? Yes. I think those are all true things. There's very interesting things people are doing. So there's a case of someone who made a bot that's like reviewer number 2, or like it's like mean reviewer. It's designed to try and tear your paper apart. You put your abstract in and it's like mean to you, and it's the idea is like, can I insulate myself from the problems like up front? And I think that is another use in this sort of adversarial use case that I think is very like fascinating. I think there was like some whole big thing about like AI generated images, and I mean that was in a journal that I think is considered sort of like barely like a predatory journal. So I don't think like serious scientists are like working in that area. So I mean, I'm not denying that these are weird issues and so forth, but I think if you're doing like real work, hopefully it's that you won't have like strange AI generated figures in there. But it can help. It helps take a lot of the pain out of doing some of the things that frankly we're not necessarily good at, like illustrations and things like that. I used AI generated Illustrator stuff to help me make a picture of something, and then I could edit it, and obviously I use what's appropriate and so forth. But I think it's an incredibly powerful tool, and especially for data analysis and code. Most scientists are not well trained in code. Like we don't do it according to best practices. We don't comment very well. Things are not interoperable. If you use AI to help you generate your code, you can make much higher quality code. And I think that it's almost, I would say, I think at some point it's a disservice bordering on like bad to not use AI to help you with your code for your papers. But these are controversial topics. I'm sure many people have solid arguments against what I'm saying, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, so Arjun, I agree that it's controversial, but it's there and it's obviously not going to go back. If anything, it's going to grow, in my opinion. And I'm wondering, you don't have to answer this. Maybe you can think about it. You can share our opinions with us later to show the community. But how good does the field has the field put together the resources for a beginner to actually know what is out there in terms of how AI can assist, for instance, in writing papers or code? Like you mentioned,
Yeah.
some like the reviewer to Rabat, right? Is there a place I can go to and see here's what's trending?
I mean, just go on Twitter, basically. I mean, this field moves so fast. It's like a full-time job just to keep track of what's happening.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, like new AI things are coming out all the time. The accessibility to actually like make these models, train them, do things is remarkable.
No.
And academia, it takes a year to publish a paper. In that amount of time, like AI is like, it just doesn't even make sense anymore. So,
Yeah.
so I think I think we don't have a lot of universities where like, we've been caught flat-footed by the pace of change.
Mm.
And so I think it's sort of, you
Yeah.
just got to go out there and search for it and ask your friends. Ask the AI.
So I just want to quickly second the people who are thanking Arjun. Arjun, thank you. Really great, insightful presentation. Really great points made there. We have so many questions. We will try to browse through, pick some, bring them out. I'm hoping maybe
Okay.
Arjun,
I
you
can
have
stay on for an extra like 5-10 minutes if that's okay.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much. And I want to try and maybe go back and forth between the written Q&A, and some people have raised their hands.
Oh, yeah,
So I'm gonna try to let Abubakar come in. Abubakar, just make sure you are in a quiet place that's not going to be interruptive. If not, we will move you out and ask you to use the Q&A, please. But we were going to allow you to come in and speak now. Abubakar, you can unmute yourself, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Now you're on mute.
I think you're muted, yeah.
Okay, for the interest of time, please put your question in the Q&A, and we're gonna let Oluwatui, Rachel, please unmute yourself. Tell us where you are and ask your question.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I am Rachel Oluwatui. I'm from Nigeria, Africa.
Great.
So I have a couple of questions here, and that was why I couldn't use the Q&A. The first question is when we're talking about the journal, submitting to journal, you mentioned about fees. You never mentioned about there are some journals that never request you to pay any amount of any feedback in that's the first question.
Sorry, I think I had
The
a little connection issue there, but if I'm understanding it, maybe I'll just answer this question. So, are there any, if I'm getting it right, it was, are there any journals that basically have no fees? And I think the answer is no. So
Exactly.
it's yeah, it's a crazy thing, right? I mean, like if you talk to other people, they're like, well, so how much do they pay you when you write an article for them? Like nothing, I pay them. It is truly an insane situation, but that's the way it is. Most of them have some sort of page charges, which are, ridiculous. You can apply for waivers, if you're in a place that just doesn't have the resources to pay for it, or you just don't have that. And I don't know how often those are granted, but I think that's the way to do it. But I think almost all the journals I know, I mean, they're going to charge you something or other to publish there, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you so much. The second question is on the duration. After you've submitted your paper to the journal, how long is good enough for you to get response from this journal? How long?
So the time for publishing is so variable. So yeah, sorry, I had a little connection issue,
Yeah,
but
so
I'll just
Rachel,
go for it.
I think Arjun has got your question, and to give space to other people,
for
so
you
we're
to
gonna
get
now.
response from this.
Okay. Okay, Rachel. So I think we got your question. We'll let Arjun answer it, and then try to get other people a chance to ask questions as well.
Yeah, the time issue is a big one. So usually when you submit a paper to a journal, usually within a week or two, but sometimes it can be longer, they tell you whether or not the paper will go to review. So basically the editor looks at it and says, this paper is good enough to go to review, so we'll get reviewers for it. Or they look at it and say, we're not going to be interested in this, and they send it back to you. So that's usually fairly fast. But it can take a couple weeks and sometimes up to a month or even longer. The next stage of it is then the peer review. And, you know, I've had peer reviews come back in 3 weeks. I've had them come back in 6 months. And there's kind of just not much you can do about it. These days, those times have been getting longer and longer because nobody wants to do peer review because you do it for free. And everyone's like, I've got 10 million things to do. And like, I'm not going to do this. So that's been a problem. And, you know, a lot of the time is not even the peer reviewers reviewing it, it's just even the editors have a hard time finding people to review. They'll go to, you know, often it'll be number 35 on their list before they get someone to actually review the paper, which sounds crazy, but that's what's going on these days. So yeah, it can take a while, and then, you know, then you have the revisions and everything that you do. It's a slow process, and I think, you know, that's one of the big problems.
I think in the Q&A, there are some questions, there are some themes, so we can just ask them all broadly together. So there are a couple of questions on how do you assess a journal, like the visibility, impact factor, especially in parsing out a good journal versus a predatory journal. And then a kind of a follow-up question on that. There are a lot of questions about preprints, what are preprints? Is it all just bioRxiv, archive? Are there any other types of preprints? When can you put it on a preprint? And how to
Yeah.
Yeah, and
preprints?
Why don't I take this?
it actually sounds like some people don't understand the difference between a journal and a preprint. So
Right.
that very basic level, that clarification.
Right. So preprint is basically, I'll just lead you through it, what we do. So we had a paper recently. So we wrote the paper up, and then we just take a PDF that we make, right? So like we wrote it in Google Docs and have the figures and everything. We just make a PDF and we put it on the preprint server. So what a preprint server is it's saying this is preprint. It's just you know, what we are putting out there. And then that just goes up and becomes a PDF that other people can download. And it's kind of like a paper, but it's not been peer reviewed. So nobody has vetted the paper in any way. I mean, there's some light vetting in the sense that, like, you know, is this even a paper kind of thing? But nobody's like, you know, engaging with the science of it really. They're just saying, okay, look, it just goes up and it goes on, you know, bioRxiv, or, you know, archive is the other one that was, you know, run by Cornell for many years, maybe still. I think there's like medRxiv and chemRxiv, like a couple different ones, but, you know, I would say archive is the first and one of the biggest, and bioRxiv has become hugely popular these days. When can you do it? Whenever you want. So you can put up a preprint basically at any time. You know, it used to be that journals didn't like it if you pre-printed, but I think they were proved so popular they had to change because obviously there's a threat to their ecosystem on some level. They've had to just kind of say like preprints are okay. You could submit the preprint before you submit the paper to the journal. You could do it at the same time. We usually do it at the same time. You could submit it early to get feedback before submitting, and, you know, sometimes we do that. You can submit it even after. So I've seen where people have submitted the paper and then like way down the process they'll submit the preprint for whatever reason. The thing with the preprint, the journals say that you are not allowed to put a preprint that addresses the reviewer comment. So your revised manuscript should not be preprinted. That's what they say. They say, oh, well, it's because our work product of the review process and whatever. I'm like, look, we wrote the paper, scientists did the reviewing. I'm going to put it up. I don't care what you say. And I don't think they're ever really going to do anything about it. Also, I would say that this doesn't make any sense because if your paper gets rejected, you can still use those reviews and revise your paper even if it doesn't go there. So it's not like they're like, well, you can't use the reviews. You know, that's it. It's an incoherent stance on their part, but formally, that's what they say. I don't know if that helps address that. And then what was the first question again? It was about determine
How do you
like
assess a journal? How do you pick what journal to submit to?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would do is say that, you know, like, so there's a numerical ranking of something called like impact factor, which is basically like how, you know, I forget the exact definition, but it's basically like how cited are papers in this journal. And that gives kind of a numerical ranking to journals. And so they're, journals are very much trying to boost their impact factor. And certainly, journals like Nature and Science have a lot of citations and they get, high impact factor. There are many journals with very low impact factors, meaning that they, the average citations per paper are much lower. That doesn't mean one journal has like higher standards necessarily than another journal. Some could argue that that may be in fact the opposite case. I don't know that that's actually true. But like I would say there's a large, the way I try and think about it is sort of like tiers of journals. So there's kind of like this, ultra echelon of like Nature, Science, Cell, and those are, there are various reasons papers get in there or not. There's sort of like a top tier, which includes those and many subfamily journals. So like a molecular sub, these will be impact factor, 10 and above, typically, just to give some kind of numerical cutoff. And those are generally considered very good journals, meaning that like your paper is not just solid, but it's like pretty interesting. Like you addressed an interesting problem, you have an interesting conclusion. Then there's kind of another tier, which is like, this is sort of like solid work, maybe it's not as interesting. And that'll be in sort of like another tier of journal. It's hard to put exact numbers on these things. A lot of it is sort of perception in the community. And by the way, journals go like up and down in these ratings all the time. 1 minute, this journal is better, that journal is better, and whatever. In the end, it's your paper that matters. That's the main thing. And then, yeah, I mean, there are these kind of like very low tier sort of predatory journals where, the peer review is very light, if non-existent, and basically they're there to kind of collect fees. How to assess those. I'm not exactly sure how you find predatory journals. I mean, if you just kind of look and you're like, this is weird, but there are probably many papers in these. So, this Frontiers journal published this weird AI thing and people like it's bad, but I bet there are a lot of really good papers in that journal. So, you don't want to like all the literature in that journal just because of that, but I think generally it would be good to avoid them if possible. Picking a journal, I would say that, like picking a journal that you think is appropriate for your paper is, I think, a really good thing. Like try not to kind of squeeze it into the wrong kind of thing, just trying to get a better, quote unquote, impact factor. I've had cases in my own career where I've succumbed to this mistake. And we had a paper that, probably shouldn't have been at this journal, but we thought, oh, this one has a higher, impact factor or something. And it went there. And, I mean, sure, it got into this like fancier journal, but like, the focus was different. And so people kind of didn't get some parts of the paper because it's just the focus was off because it was the wrong thing. So, I would avoid those kind of things because in the long run, you want people to engage with your work. And, the thing at all of these journals to keep in mind is that the citation impact factor is about average citations. The citation distribution, you'd be amazed at how long tail it is. For all of these journals, there are like a few papers that generate tons of citations, and most of them get very few. And you want to be the person who's doing the best work at that journal, right? You want to be the person who's doing the work that somehow influences people. And yeah, what journal you're in, no doubt about it, that will shape how much influence you get because people will read it more if it's one or the other. But do the best job you can. And in the end, that's kind of the only part of it that you can control. So, like it's easy to get really wrapped up in like, all these kind of, I should be in this journal or that journal. And at some point, it's just like, get your work out and do the best kind of work you can, and that'll pay off in the long run.
That's good. Yeah, I feel like also beyond just Googling, I don't know, just being in a scientific environment, I learned a lot about the reputation of journals beyond impact factor just by existing in a scientific environment, going to conferences. Like, for example, JCB, it's a historic old journal that is, I think its reputation is beyond its impact factor. So I don't know. I think also asking beyond just Googling.
Yeah, I would second that. And also just like, where are you reading papers that you like? If you're reading a bunch of papers in genome biology and that's kind of like your area, then maybe that's a great journal for you.
Yeah,
like
that's a great point. I think my PhD advisor once told me, like, what journals did you get papers from that you read to cite for your own paper? Like, where are they coming the most? Those are the people who are gonna read your work, so target those journals, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna, Arjun, if you have a few minutes, I'm gonna let Emmanuel come in and ask his question, and then we may, I don't know if we'll have any more time, but Emmanuel, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Everyone, Gabriel, thank you very much for this opportunity. Can you guys hear me, please?
Yes, we can, and tell us where you are. I know where you are, but tell everybody.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm Emmanuel Adejaba and I'm from Ghana. Yeah, so
Hi.
Hi. So that was a very nice presentation, Raj. But I have a quick question. Is it advisable to submit a paper to more than one journals?
So formally, usually when you submit a paper to a journal, you're not allowed to send it to another journal. So you can only submit to one at a time, which is why it's kind of slow. I mean, I think the idea is that, well, look, if you're considering us, then, you can't send it to multiple at once. That definitely slows things down because, it's like, well, what if this place is not the right place or whatever? But, it's like if you submitted to multiple journals and then multiple reviewers got the same thing from multiple, it would be kind of weird. But yeah, so generally you can't submit to multiple journals at the same time. But with the pre-submission inquiries, the reason why they're useful is that they are not formal submissions. You're just basically asking for an opinion. And so you can submit 10 of them at the same time and send it to all these different journals at once. And then you'll see like, okay, well, these journals are interested and I like this one, so I'll pick this one to go forward with, right? And then you do the formal submission. And that can save you a lot of time because if you had to go through 10 journals one by one, it might take you like, 3 months just to get to the point of review. And so that can save you a lot of trouble.
Right. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, for the respect of time, we should probably end
Yeah,
here.
sorry, this guy's he's shown up and he's
Smiling,
hi.
yeah, there are a lot of questions, but I think the session was to get people thinking on this, find ways to find your answers beyond this. And of course, Arjun, you did offer your expertise to anyone, so
Yeah,
we're sorry we couldn't get through everything, but this is a topic that always generates a lot of questions.
Yeah,
I'm sure. So
it's a big one.
Like I said,
and
just contact me.
yeah, that's really important. You can reach out to Arjun, and I just want to mention that we intend to do this event every year. So you join multiple times, you learn more, and just keep an eye out for the events. And like Arjun said, reach out if you have any questions. Sinusha, I'll give it back to you if you have any final comments. I just want to say thank you so much again, Arjun, for wonderful presentation and insights.
Absolutely.
Alex, go ahead.
No, I just saying thank you, Arjun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for your time, for just being so candid about all your thoughts. I liked how you started with the big picture of, why do we publish? Sometimes you lose sight of the big picture when you're like thinking, what journal do I submit? What's the impact factor? But the idea is that you put your science out there and then you are also, while you're rising in your career. And so I really like that you started with that big picture. So yeah, thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to have you, and we hope, we can engage. You will engage with AfriSNet in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful program you all have put together. It's really been a pleasure for me. And yeah, hopefully we can do it again sometime. All right, bye.
Thank you everyone for coming in from all over the world. Yeah, have a good weekend.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.